Well, welcome everyone to my strategic class. So I wanted to actually use you guys shamelessly to look at a game of mine which I found was a very strategically complicated game, kind of difficult to play, and there were a lot of interesting moments and interesting questions in it. So I thought I would look over that, and we'll see if anything interesting happens. All right. So knight f3, it was a king's Indian. I usually fianchetto kind of lamely. Sometimes I'll play other systems, but this is what I've been doing lately. So king's Indian, e5. So the trend in more recent years is to either play a system with bishop f5, maybe bishop g4, but the main line goes like a6, rook b8, trying to play for b5. The positions are very strategically complex. But black plays e5, which is considered somewhat committal. And I play here. And the main line which I was aware of at the time, I should say, goes knight e7. White plays here because otherwise the knight can come out sometimes. And then usually white plays knight e1 to d3, followed by f4 sometimes. And it's just very typical. This knight maneuver, by the way, in these pawn structures, the knight often belongs here. So it's a very typical maneuver, one which I would pay attention to. My opponent played here, which actually is quite a common move, but for some reason I wasn't that familiar with it at the time, and I was thinking, okay, well, what to do? So what occurred to me in this position is that the main battle for the opening, after this move, after knight e7, it's slightly different. Black plays more on the king side with f5. But in this line, it's not so much about f5. What is the strategic battle based around? Try to identify important squares. What's an important square? Like, why is the knight going to b8 instead of e7, which is, I would argue, slightly more typical in a king's Indian. So when I tried to think about this position, I felt like black's ideal setup would be to put the pawn on a5 and get the knight to c5. So normally black doesn't like to play on the queen side in a king's Indian. Usually I have the queen side and black tries to play on the king side. But first of all, in fianchettos, it's usually harder for black to attack. But also the bishop doesn't control the queen side as well. So a little bit of a double-edged sword, but the idea is that black wants to put her knight on c5 and eventually, yes, play for f5 and essentially fight for the e4 square is sort of the idea. So I played knight e1, which of course is fairly normal, trying to play my idea. I could play e4 as well, but probably doesn't matter that much. Black plays a5, trying to stop b4 ideas. It's important to note, by the way, that if you play b4 too early, you often allow which move? This is a common strategic theme in the king's Indian. Forget for the moment that this diagonal is open and e4 might be strong. E4, knight d4 anyway, but just forget about e4 for the moment. What is the other problem with b4?
C5 then?
Well, if you play knight a6 and I play b5, then you're absolutely right. The problem is that I'm not obligated to play b5. I can play a3 even, and now your knight looks a little strange. So you have to be careful how you do it. But you're in the right ballpark. So again, it's a fairly common King's Indian theme. You challenge this b pawn. And the problem is that I don't really want to take or push, right? And I can't defend it with a3 because my rook hangs. So it's kind of a typical thing where if you play b4 too early, you run into a5. So if you're looking at it from white's perspective, almost any time, thank you, almost any time you have to you want to play b4, you have to look out for a5. Oops. So knight e1, a5. So I played rook b1, which is a bit unusual, but I'm going to explain my reasoning. So after e4, this is the main line I looked at. e4 would be a fairly logical choice, right? Knight a6, knight d3, and now I thought black would play knight d7, followed by knight dc5, followed by f5. I don't think this position's bad for white. To me, this looks fairly normal. However, what I didn't like about it is that all my opponent's pieces make perfect sense. I would rather they struggle a little more to coordinate their pieces. And I didn't necessarily do anything better, I have to admit. What I did is not necessarily better, but I wanted to at least make my opponent think a little bit. My opponent, incidentally, was another GM who's played the King's Indian, and I knew his King's Indian experience was probably a lot more than mine. So I wanted to kind of throw him off a little, so I played this move, which is very typical for these types of positions. So what do you think my idea is? So let's say, for example, black plays knight a6 and whistles. What is the idea? Think about, what's the key square again? c5. How does rook b1 contribute to controlling c5? I also like to point out that it's very important to play knight e1 first. If you play rook b1 and allow bishop f5 with tempo and have to move back, it's very depressing. So it's important that the knight's here so I can always play e4. Just a side note. But okay, how do I make it so that after knight c5 I have a response? And now, believe it or not, black has a slight problem. Because if knight c5, I simply play b4. If knight d7, I don't play knight d3, I don't play e4, I just play b4. And this is a problem, because this knight now just doesn't make any sense. So again, I'm not saying that what I'm doing was better or worse, but I wanted to throw my opponent off a little bit. And sure enough, he took quite a long think here. I'd say at least 20 minutes. But he found what I thought was a pretty decent move. Played this. So what on earth could be his idea? And this is why I think the King's Indian is such an awful opening to teach beginners, or to teach people who need to learn how to play chess. Because ideas like this are typical. And in order to find ideas like this, you have to know exactly what's going on in the position and what the strategic motifs are. So again, for any player who's learning to play chess, learn a system where you control the center and you play normal-ish moves, and then you can go to stuff like this. But it's pretty difficult to understand all these maneuvers. But we're going to give it a shot. So knight d7. What is black up to? Let's say I play a3. Seems like a logical move, right? Not what I did. But what could be the idea after a move like a3? f5 is possible. Certainly not a terrible idea. But I'm not so sure it actually helps. I can still play with b4. Maybe you can play with e4 afterwards. That might be interesting. I don't know how strong it is. Maybe I should also play with e4. I don't know. F5 is interesting. I can tell you that during the game, what worried me a bit more was something like this. So completely different direction, but what's the idea?
Avoid b4.
You avoid b4 because you're taking advantage of the fact that this c-pawn, and this is something that is one of the main drawbacks of the fianchetto, which I've learned. Because I like the fianchetto, but this is one of the things I hate about it, that the c-pawn ends up weak a lot. So I have to play b3. I mean, I could play a move like queen d3, but now black just plays here, and now I would say I've lost the strategic battle. This is what people would say, because black's going to put a knight on c5. This is a weakness. My pawns are restricted. My pawns are not connected. This is the kind of thing you almost never want to allow. This is what happens when you basically lose an opening battle. Doesn't mean you're much worse or anything like that, but your position is just not a lot of fun. So you can play b3, but now, even if black just develops normally, what's your idea? This knight doesn't make sense now. Nothing about the position is that normal, and also a4 can be an idea as well, breaking up the pawns entirely. So you see how one little move can make that big of a difference? If black had played knight a6 and allowed a3, b4, this would just be miserable. But because of one little difference, now I'm the one who has to figure out a problem. So I decided to play e4, basically saying I'm not putting a knight on d3, I'm not committing anything. I want to see what you're doing, and I want to play a useful move in the meantime. So black played knight to c5. Notice he's not playing knight a6 yet. So what's his idea if I play a3 now? Let's say it happens. a3. Trying to play b4. Can black stop me?
Knight a6 can be played.
If knight a6, I can play b4, right?
a4.
Uh-huh. We see our familiar pattern, right? And all of a sudden, not so easy. Again, I would say black's won the strategic battle, more or less. Because I can't get in b4, which is not good. This is basically, again, as I pointed out before, the structure which you just do not want to allow. And note how this pawn is really hard to attack. So again, that's one of the points of black doing this first, because now this rook still supports this pawn. a4 is still a viable push. So instead, I decided to play b3. I should say I was not happy to play b3. It meant that in order to play for b4, I'd have to play a3, then b4, and it's just slow. I did not like having to play this move. But honestly, I didn't really find a suitable alternative. Maybe a move like bishop e3, or even just knight d3, just trading off a pair of knights. Again, not exactly what I want, but maybe those would have been nicer options. I've looked at this, I've spent a while looking at this position, and I still don't know, to give you an idea. So I just find that these positions are very complex, and I'm hoping to find someone who can explain them to me. So if you guys come up with anything, do let me know. So black played f5. So here the question is how to react to this move. Always a tricky question. A lot of people automatically play f3. I'd say this is, depending on the situation, can be normal and it can be a mistake. So knight d3 is possible. One of the possible drawbacks is that if black exchanges and brings another knight to c5, you might lose some time. But I don't hate a move like knight d3. The problem you have, though, in any of these positions is that allowing black to take on e4 is kind of tricky now. Because usually if black ever takes this pawn rather than pushing past, and again, this is how you figure things out strategically, what is the battle around? What square becomes the most important if black ever takes on e4? So say this happens. Knight d3, and for example, knight takes e4 even. Don't play f4, guys. What is the battle around? Which square? I would say e6 is kind of hard to get to, but it could be important later. But yeah, e4. So if black can play, like for example, knight d7, knight f6, bishop f5 really quickly, I think I'm going to lose this battle. And it doesn't mean, again, it doesn't mean it's disaster and I can resign. It just means that things are going black's way. And that's kind of the way you think of strategy. It often doesn't mean one side's that killing or that doing that well. It usually just means one side has a more pleasant way of things. So I'd say this is like a, positions like this could be, say, a fairly pleasant King's Indian for black because, again, I want a knight coming to e4. And that's just not a really easy thing to do because if I play f3, my bishop's stuck. If I move back and play f3, I just look like an idiot. Which, I mean, that does happen, but ideally I don't want to put my pieces like that, right? I want to be able to put a knight on e4, but how do I do it? So that's why I don't really like this position for white. And I honestly didn't like my position that much here. But I felt like the only way to try to justify my play was to play f3. And just say, you know what, if you play f4 and try to mate me, good luck to you, buddy. I'll deal with it. But mainly it was just, I didn't see what else to do. I thought that if I allowed takes on e4, black just has a fairly pleasant game. Whereas here I thought that black at least had some questions to answer. So black did in fact play f4, which I think is a reasonable choice. So the second black plays f4, we have a strategic change, right? And this is the key to playing a strategic game well. You have to be able to know when the position changes, when the battles change. Remember how the battle was for e4? Do you think the battle's for e4 now? Where's the battle? And keep in mind, there doesn't have to be one answer to this. There are usually many battles going on at once. It's like Game of Thrones, just everywhere. Well, what's one? F4 definitely is a signal. What is F4 signal? What is black going to play? What I'm asking more is not a specific move, but what is black's general, where is black going to try to play? The second black plays F4, the center closes, right? Do you think black's going to try to play on the queen side? Why not?
Well, the chain of pawns is pointing to the king, the bishop, the light square bishop is open, the queen is open.
I really like this rule. Quite often, you want to play where your pawns are pointing. Sounds weird. And I know mine are pointing both directions and blah, blah, blah. But the other rule is you play where you have more space. Almost always in the King's Indian, white has more space on the queen side. That's my side of the board. You don't get to play on that side unless I mess up. The center sometimes can be played in. Like, for example, if black had opted to take if I don't play F3, then you're playing in the center, right? But the second black plays F4, you're no longer battling over the center. Black's saying, you have more space there, you have more space on the queen side. Eventually, I'm going to lose on the queen side. But I'm going to checkmate you first. I know, it's rude, right? But that's kind of what F4 signals. Anytime in the King's Indian, oftentimes it happens right out of the opening. And that's just the opening. You know, black gets the pawn to F4, white charges on the queen side, black charges on the king side. I personally don't usually like those positions because first and foremost, I don't like to get checkmated. And in those positions, that's kind of the risk. I prefer a game where we're both kind of battling all over. That doesn't mean I don't play those positions. Sometimes you have to, but... And here I have to, right? Black played F4. I do have a bishop on G2, which means it's harder to mate me. But it also means it's harder to play on the queen side. Nonetheless, after F4, where do I absolutely have to play? And probably I should play very quickly. Yes. That's my side of the board. I have to get something going on the queen side. Which means, which move am I going to play? Because as difficult as this position is, I found this move very easy.
A3.
Yeah, I went with A3. B4, then pawn takes, it's very hard to dislodge anything. But the drawback of A3, of course, is black can play which move? And it's a move we've already discussed.
A4.
So the question now is, do I play B4 and push past, or do I capture on A4? That is your next decision. And by the way, I was burning loads of time, my opponent's burning loads of time. This is often what happens when a position becomes strategically complex, because we're just trying to figure things out. In the back of our minds, if we're smart, which again, not always, but we know that we can't use all our time because the position is going to stay complicated. But these are decisions which are permanent decisions. If I play B4 or if I take on A4, that's a permanent decision. It's basically, I either keep things closed and maybe try to win the A4 pawn, or I take on A4, mess up my pawns, but keep the queen side open. And again, it's a decision that's, I don't want to say life or death because that sounds way too dramatic, but it's basically one is probably much better than the other. So these are the key decisions that you have to really focus on and make, again, when you're having this kind of strategic battle with an opponent. So what?
B4.
B4. I did not like B4. So knight B3 annoyed me.
I was considering if it's possible at some point take rook B3 and take the pawn.
Well, I had some problems. So first of all, I want to be able to just win A4. If I can't win A4, by the way, I hate playing B4. Because now this knight's just annoying, right? I don't want this guy in my territory. So I looked at taking this pawn, which is tactically playable. But I thought after rook takes, knight takes, my position was actually quite miserable. This knight can't move, and it's stuck on the edge of the board. I've lost my dark square bishop, and in all likelihood, black can just start, maybe play your move now that there's no bishop open, right? So now your move becomes really strong, I think, because queen g5, and all of a sudden it's like, I have no dark square bishop. I kind of hate my life, to be honest. So this I did not want. So I wanted to play here, but then even so, this takes idea just was so annoying. I was sitting there going, "Arr." There's even knight d2 sometimes. So I saw this, I saw these threats, I saw this line, and I basically in my head I just went no. And sometimes that's what it takes. Like a lot of the times you have to calculate clear lines, and typically it's better. But sometimes it's just you see certain variations and you just know it's wrong. You just know I can't allow this. This is too much. So bite the bullet. Knight takes a4. But one of the things I discovered the more I looked at this position, and you could say I lucked out a little bit because it didn't happen to happen this way, but I actually liked my position more the more I looked at it. First of all, I eliminate one of black's only developed pieces. Black has no development here. And although my pawn structure got open, I don't think that's the end of the world. And the reason why is because I can still try to play on the queen side. I can still play for c5. I can still open things up. Now, if black had better development, I'd hate my queen side. To give you an idea, a friend of mine who is also a GM and who plays the King's Indian a lot, knows a lot more about it than I do, thought my position was really bad here. And I told him, we analyzed this some, and after a while he was like, and he's usually a pretty optimistic guy, but he was like, maybe not so bad. And the reason why is, again, because strategically it looks really bad. But because black's not developed, all of a sudden there are different ideas for both sides. So here he played a move which, again, my friend hated. And I was a bit surprised by, but it's an interesting move. He played c5. I thought queen e8 was actually kind of clever, trying to win my pawn. But I can even just play knight d3, say have the pawn, I'm going to play c5 next. And again, you're not developed, is kind of my claim. Strategically, yes, black has some ideas. But if I can just get in c5, I don't know. Life is not so bad. I looked at a bunch of things here. G5, I have c5. Takes, like, this was interesting. Then I wasn't exactly sure what to do. But even here, I think that the position is quite unclear. In any case, because again, I'm not necessarily even playing for advantage. I just want a position I know how to play. And at least I thought here it was double-edged. Black has good chances, but I have some chances. So he played c5, which I thought was a little bit strange, but it is a common King's Indian idea where sometimes you take a move to play c5 and it kills any ideas with c5 I have. But I actually have a very annoying and very simple idea here, which just makes black's position very difficult. And which you guys are going to find, obviously. So what is black's next idea, probably, in all likelihood? So say I were to play knight d3. What do you guys think black would do? Maybe black plays g5, I don't know, but just as an idea. Like, say black gets a free move, is what I'm asking. What pawn of white's is particularly weak? c4 is kind of hard to attack, though. What pawn is much easier to attack? Yeah. So I think that if I give black any time, black's going to go after a4. So the question is, how do I make it so that a4 becomes not a weakness but a strength? I would like to. So how can I do that? What?
Bishop d2.
Yeah. So I play bishop d2 with the idea of putting the pawn on a5 next. Black plays here. Black has to play on the king side, right? There's no other side. Black doesn't get to play anywhere else. It's the rules. So a5. Now again, I'm not threatening anything, but notice how now all of a sudden this pawn is a real weakness, right? Which means this bishop has trouble moving. Not that it has that many great squares anyway, but if this bishop gets paralyzed, it often means other pieces also will get paralyzed. It means this rook can't get out into the game. It means this knight is going to have a hard time getting out. So yes, if black had pieces over on the king side, I'd be terrified. I'd be shaking in my boots going, all right, please do not mate me. But because black has no pieces out, and because black's pieces are tied up, it's actually very difficult to do. So black keeps pushing. I improve my pieces. Black plays knight d7. So here, I played kind of a normal-ish move, I would call it. But I did have an alternative which might have been strong as well. again, I would call this idea sort of strategic in that it's an idea where if you can get this sort of thing in, it often means you can even be strategically winning, we would call it, right? Like, you get this in and your opponent's just in big trouble. So what piece can white activate here? It's kind of difficult, right? The knight's not amazing, but it's on a decent square. It's as good as it's going to get, right? The bishop's doing its job, protecting this pawn. These guys are not really that easy to improve. What can be improved, possibly? The queen can definitely be improved. I played queen e2 to give you an idea. But even on e2, I wasn't sure I was improving myself that much, to be honest. I was playing it because I didn't see what black was going to do, and I thought queen e2 was definitely better than queen on d1. That's why I played it. I don't think it's a terrible move, but I had another possibility which I spent some time on here, in which my opponent surely was not happy to allow, but he probably didn't have much of a choice, right? If he doesn't get his knight in the game, he probably just loses. This is the kind of move that's easy to forget about. But basically, if I can play bishop e6 check, for example, maybe play g4, h3 to completely... If I ever lock up the king side completely, black can almost resign. It sounds like a lot. That sounds like an overstatement. But basically, if I get in rook b6, eventually I'm going to crash through on the queen side for sure, right? So if black has zero counterplay on the king side, it's basically a strategically lost game. So if I can do something like this, exchange off my bad bishop, it could be good. The only danger is that this bishop is also guarding my king. I think what worried me during the game was something like this, some nonsense along these lines. But I think I could have just been greedy and just said, whatever, I'm just taking everything. But it's hard to do this during a game. During a game, you don't want to allow counterplay, you know? But sometimes, not such a big deal. But okay, I didn't have to play bishop h3, and I didn't. I played queen e2. Black played knight here. And here, I decided to take the pawn. Yeah, if rook b6, I allow rook a6. I didn't see anything clear. I don't really want to put this pawn from here to here, actually. I thought that would be good for black. I'd like to have a passed a pawn, if at all possible. So I took this pawn. These kind of moves, by the way, sometimes are surprising to people. But it actually forces black to make a tough decision. If black takes with the g-pawn, I can play, for example, king h1, rook g1. How is black ever going to get at my king then? Almost impossible, right? I even have moves like rook g1, knight f2, queen f1. It looks ridiculous, but black is completely paralyzed over here. And if I get in bishop h3, just to give you an idea what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to play a million moves in a row. I hope you guys will excuse me. But just to show you, I'd also like to point out that black has very few useful moves here. If I get in bishop h3 here, it's just nothing, right? Black has no attack and very simple to play for white, no? Probably just lost. So obviously black's not going to just sit, but there aren't that many useful things to do here. It's going to be very, very difficult to ever attack me. So black played a very understandable move, trying to keep the game complicated, right? When you have a position you don't like, it's very important to at least make it so you don't have to just suffer, right? You want a game that's complicated. But objectively, this is also rough. And that's one of the purposes of queen e2, by the way, that I wanted black to have to move here. Because black, I didn't see that many great moves. I have plenty of improvements. I can play king h1 next. I can play bishop h3 is still in the air. I have a lot of moves. Black does not. So he had to make this decision of allowing this pawn capture. But here I think white has a pretty strong move. What is the drawback of playing ef? Yes, indeed. So you pretty much have to take. If you ever allow e6, it's usually just good night, Irene, kind of. So you must take. And here, actually, I had a huge choice. I could take on e5, but I didn't like getting pinned. Queen takes looked just awkward. But my whole idea was to take the c-pawn. The idea being that now b7 is super weak. And if I absolutely must, I can play knight e6 and snag this bishop. Often without this bishop, attacking is very difficult. It's kind of the idea. So I thought that even though this looks kind of double-edged, I thought that ultimately this should be quite good for white. And I was correct. However, unfortunately for myself, I made my life a lot harder with my next move. So my main choice was, I could either defend this knight, or I could play knight e6, getting rid of this guy. One choice is not good, and unfortunately that's what I played. So you guys are going to find the superior choice. Yeah, it's funny, when I look at this now, it's like, I'm like, really? I played that? But, you know, sometimes during a game, things are murkier. You kind of see ghosts, you're like, oh, I don't want to allow that, even without calculating it properly, kind of thing. Not to excuse myself, but. Bishop b4 is one of the moves I looked at. It's not a bad move. I think rook b5 is even stronger, because then I can play bishop b4 next, and it looks a little weird, but black has no way to ever take advantage of this. So rook b5 would have been very strong, but for some reason I panicked here, and I thought I had to do something quicker. And it's just not true, because black just doesn't have a threat. Even if black plays g4, so what? There's nothing really happening. There's no real threat. My bishop on g2 may look ridiculous, but it keeps my king very, very safe. And it's one of the perks to playing this line in the first place. But white, I played here, and now the game just became a mess. Black played here. So here I had a choice. I could have played h4. I thought forever on this move. The idea being that it looks kind of almost suicidal, but the idea is that now, if takes, I can play bishop h3, and if g4, I can take and take. But I saw these pawns, and I think something inside me was like, no, Josh, just don't do it. I had a nightmare the other night about these 3 pawns. You don't want to end up living that scenario. But ultimately, you can actually just do this, and I think it was decent. I could take with the bishop. And this I looked at as well. Again, I was scared about e4 and the queen coming in, but sometimes when you have a position you think is really good, you'll often go way out of your way to prevent counterplay. This is a GM tendency in particular. I'm definitely guilty of doing this when sometimes you have to allow your opponent to do a couple things, you know? You can't just run over them with no counterplay. That's just not realistic. So I had to allow some of this, and probably it would have been good. But the move I played was kind of interesting. Bishop h3. It looks logical. I'm just defending my pawn. This pawn, by the way, is a real thorn in black's side if he doesn't get rid of it. But of course, he's an active player. He has to go for it, so he plays e4. So the question is how to handle this advance. Because it looks kind of scary. If black ever takes and plays g4, my bishop's going to feel a little frightened. And bishops are really a pain when they feel frightened. They go kind of crazy with it. Yeah, and here I realized things were not so easy. I had messed up. I had not played this the best way. But I still have to find a move, right? I could just try to offer a draw, but that seemed a little silly. So what to do? Make the best of the situation, which is a lot of what chess is sometimes. Rook b6, but does that address the problem of takes f3 and g4? I don't know. I mean, it's maybe f4 hangs in those lines, but I'm trying to remember exactly what I was afraid of. Whether I was afraid of like e3 first or check first. I was afraid of something. I can promise you this. I think what I was afraid of, just to give you an idea, I'm not sure about the check first. That's a tricky one. I think maybe the check. So give the check, and then this one, and this. Yeah, this I did not like. Probably better with the queen back on c7, actually. But yeah, I did not want any piece of this. This to me looked like a nightmare. So yeah, rook b6 was not my move. I decided to give back a little bit. I realized, you know what? If I give black time to play g4 and just play f3, I'm just going to have a miserable life. So I'm like, you know what? Come at me. g4. f3. So I sack a piece. I didn't want to sack a piece. It wasn't my intention when I woke up that morning, but at the same, and it looks kind of weird because I don't have a single healthy pawn. All my pawns have some varying degree of sickness, some ailments. But I have a lot of them. And sometimes just having lots of pawns can actually be stronger than you think. Like there's this tendency where it's like, oh, all the pawns are weak. We assume they all fall at once. But they don't. Black has to spend moves taking them. And that's kind of the downfall here. So black actually had the best move for black was queen c6. And after that, probably it's more drawish than not. I think the line went bishop c3, rook takes e6, rook b6. And I win a piece. I win my piece back, but all my pawns just kind of fall. And okay, I'm still technically up a pawn, but it's closer to a draw than a win, let's put it that way. That being said, black has to find it in his heart to give back the piece. It's not always such an easy decision psychologically. Instead, black took this immediately. But now after rook takes b7, there are some problems. Now all of a sudden this a-pawn is an absolute monster. Glad I held on to that. And it's just not so easy because black's king is actually weaker than mine despite being up a piece. So he played here. I played rook b6, black took. But here I found a very, very nice variation.
With the low diagonal, no?
Yes, indeed. So e5. So yeah, rook f8 was one of the moves I expected. But I can... Oh yeah, this move I missed, I think, during the game. This was pretty strong, but I didn't see this one at all. But I think, yeah, if rook takes e6, then knight e4 is actually quite nasty. So I have to be careful. I still have this move, though. But yeah, if I can also just take this knight, I think. And if rook takes... I forget exactly what my idea was. Oh yeah, I can always play bishop f4 and kind of shield myself. But again, this was a little bit tricky, but this was the move I expected. But now, believe it or not, this is a very tricky choice because I have 3 pieces I can take here. And I can tell you that very rarely is taking all of them okay. Usually something's wrong with one of them. So the question is to find which piece do you capture first. So many captures, so little time, etc., etc.
I like to take the rook with check.
It's hard to decline a rook with check. Yeah, this was a tricky moment because neither of us had a lot of time here, and the game was still quite complicated. He had less time than me, thankfully, which helped out a lot. But yeah, if pawn takes rook is originally what I wanted to play, because now I have 2 connected pawns, it looked beautiful, but after this move I wasn't sure what to do. b7 looks nice, but even rook f8 might be playable. And it's some just complete mess. So none of that really appealed to me. And yeah, if takes the knight, which I also wanted to play, there was some issue. Maybe just rook takes and give up the piece back, and it was complicated at least. So I did take this rook with check, king h7. And this was kind of the key move. This was the move where when I saw this move, I knew, okay, I got this. Kind of like, all right, my position will be good. It's hard when everything's hanging, right? But luckily, black has a very strong threat, which makes your options more limited. What is black's very strong threat? Taking the rook with mate. So your move ideally should prevent that. Queen f3, I think, allowed rook b3, I want to say. That is check. I wasn't sure. I thought I found a nicer move with queen g2. Because now there are often moves like rook g1 in the horizon as well, which can be quite strong. So yeah, if rook e6, which was what I expected, takes rook g1. And this is the key, that I don't try to trade rooks, because if I trade rooks, my king is very exposed, right? But if I keep the rooks on the board, then black's king is just super weak. And then I can probably just push my a-pawn at my leisure, sort of. And also, it's hard to not let me trade anything. For example, if queen f7, I can just take on g7 and play bishop c3, and it's just over because of the pin. So instead, he played this one. pawn takes knight. So it's very important that after rook takes d2, I have mate. He took back. Rook g1. And this is the setup I liked. This is the one I saw. Basically, my king is completely safe, and I'm threatening his king. So yeah, having the two pawns is nice, even though they're doubled. But the key that's going to let me win more easily is that black's king is very weak. And that's kind of the key to this position, more than the pawns almost. If I didn't have any pawns, it would be harder to win, obviously. But making sure black's passive and defending against mate threats and pushing my pawns, that's kind of the key. So black played queen back to f7. I gave a check. I like to centralize my pieces. King back. Bishop e3. Note how I'm making sure I'm covering every single diagonal. So black objectively maybe should try to trade queens, but the problem is then I can just put a pawn on a7. And with the bishop here, that's going to be pretty much just dead. This is one of those situations where if it's a rook endgame, it becomes way more complicated. But as long as there are bishops on the board with a pawn here, it's just quite too much. So black played rook b3. So how did I try to finish things? Because it's weird, like black's king is cornered, but it's not that easy to actually give checkmate. The queen on e4 is perfect. You don't want to mess with a perfect piece.
E6.
Rook where?
G6.
Rook g6. I would be a little nervous about playing a move like rook g6. That's the thing. I don't think I would consider it. Like, I just wouldn't consider it because it's like, well, what if rook takes e3, then check, then maybe it works, but then I have to allow king g8 and check here. Yeah. You see what I mean? And it's just like, no.
But bishop d4?
Basically, things can go wrong if you do things like that. Bishop d4 is definitely a pretty nice looking move. The only thing is after takes, you've exchanged the bishops, right? Which means you better have mate or a forced win. Probably you do, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't know. It's kind of annoying, right? It looks really nice, but there's no immediate mate. And again, if you allow queen f3, you allow queen trade, drawing chances increase very rapidly.
Yeah.
But now all of a sudden black has kind of a problem, right? Because this pin is actually very difficult to get rid of. Rook takes a3, but there was a last trick. How does white finish the game?
Rook f6.
So this is why people play, like there's a very specific reason why people resign at certain times. So he could resign here pretty easily, but he decided to take my pawn first, and this was actually the reason. If rook takes f6, it looks like a killer, right?
Yeah, but it's not.
But the problem is that here black has an escape, which is that black just keeps giving checks. And the king can't get out. You could take this rook, but then I take and take, right? So it's just a draw. So again, it's why you always have to be careful to the very last moment. Luckily, there's another move which makes black resign a lot easier. Because that was the key. Rook f1, I wasn't actually threatening rook takes f6. That wasn't my idea. What was the idea? Yep? Bishop d4 does the trick. Because now if you take on d4, I can just take your queen. There's no mate or anything weird with the rook. So I did double check that because I've seen weird things. But okay, yeah. And now the problem is rook takes f6 is a threat, and then my rook can block with checks, and bishop takes f6 is a check. It's just too many threats. So that was the end. But again, I mean, a really complicated game. It looked kind of iffy for me for a little while. And again, it's just one of those positions where it's hard to figure everything out. I couldn't figure it out. I don't think my opponent, who knew those positions pretty well, figured it all out. But the key is that you just have to take it one move at a time. You want to have a general plan. You want to have an underlying theme. You want to know when the position changes. Like when black played f4, remember, it was like trumpets sound. Like, okay, I have to play queenside. He has to play kingside. But the key is to make sure that every decision, you make the best decision you can at that time. If you're not sure what to do, just don't make your position worse. Try to improve your position, try to play on your side of the board, but, just try not to make a bad decision. If you're not sure what the best decision is, just don't weaken your position, don't make it worse. I'd say that that's how people lose strategically more often than not. It's not that they're not finding a great strategic idea, it's that they're weakening their position for no reason. It's that they're allowing their opponent to do a little too much. So if you can take anything from this game, it's that I didn't understand my position perfectly whatsoever, but I took it one move at a time. I mostly avoided blunders. Obviously, when we were both low on time, the game got crazy. I sacked a piece, but even so, I felt like even during that time, black had the difficult position to play. And it was because earlier, I just somehow found a way to, not make my position worse. So sometimes that's kind of what you have to do. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed it.